Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I will start the session in a few seconds. Just let us wait for another 1 or 2 minutes. I think we can start so we can finish on time. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today in our interesting webinar. This is CIPS Bahrain branch. Let me introduce myself. My name is Fadila Al-Sharaf, and I will introduce my colleagues. This is CIPS Bahrain branch committee, Ms. Shayma, Sayed Sulaiman, Saleh Al-Madhoub, Rajif, and Mr. Makki, and finally, Sayed Ahmed. Thank you for joining. As you know that our topic is today about negotiation, which is a very interesting topic for every procurement professional. It's a core competency. We'll learn today new tips and tactics from Mr. Fabian, who will be guiding us on how technology can help us on improving our negotiation skills. So, Fabian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Fadila, for having me.
And introduce yourself.
So, can you see my screen? All good?
Yes.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for having me. I really, really appreciate it. And I hope now that everybody has been watching soccer for the last couple of weeks and is all excited about that there's still a lot of energy also for sourcing and for negotiations, especially. Yes, today is about negotiations, and as you said, it's a core competency of procurement, and it's a core competency of procurement for every size of company across every country in the world. And that's what I really, really enjoy about it as well. So thank you very much for having me and for letting me share a little bit of insights. I am Fabian. I have spent the last almost 15 years in procurement, working as a category manager, working as a procurement consultant, then working on the tech side. And now I just started my own company focused on procurement, where we want to enable procurement to deliver basically digital technology and really make sure that everybody can finally reap the benefits of it. And again, it's a very international topic, and so therefore I try to work with people really across the world, and that's why this invitation from your branch was really, really much appreciated. I focus on three things, basically. I focus on procurement performance. That's what we will focus on today as well, because that's where it's all about sourcing and negotiations. But I also work a lot on digitalization, where it's about identifying the procurement digitalization roadmap, all the way to finding the right vendors to work with and bringing that to life. And then last but not least, indirect procurement, which is one of those areas that I think a lot of organizations still struggle with. And that I am very, very passionate about. So in the space of performance, I think there's there's a couple of points in here that actually already kind of paved the way into the topic. You can see savings opportunity assessments, you can see e-auctions, sourcing optimization, game theoretic negotiation design. So basically everything that has to do with the core of our profession. And yeah, I was just fortunate enough to work with some of the largest organizations, but also with some relatively small organizations. And I found that across them, as I said before, this topic is so, is really at the very core of what we do. So enough about that. Let's talk about how we can enhance the negotiation toolkit, right? So everybody has hopefully been to a standard negotiation training. And so I only want to recap on a couple of points there for a moment before I go a little bit further. But whenever we talk about negotiations, we really also talk about sourcing. And I think that's quite important because a negotiation really only marks the end of a sourcing process, right? So we have the RFI where we collect all of the information, and we do the RFP where we find ideas of how we can solve our problem. And then we have potentially multiple rounds of pricing in the RFQ. And throughout this entire process, we collect so much information, but then at the end of the day, when it comes to negotiation, very often we just pick up the phone 5 minutes before or like 5 minutes before we pick up the phone to the supplier, we just have a final look at the last figures that he has provided us with. And that's our preparation for the negotiation. And it's very sad because there's so much that we should consider and that we might just lose out on. And that's why I think negotiation technology, and that's where we're now leading into, has a big role to play in order to help us not just be so focused on individual aspects, but really to bring in more of this overall perspective. And so what I'm trying to show with this chart is that it kind of mirrors a little bit the development of procurement technology and especially sourcing technology over the last 25 years. So we are now at a time where basically autonomous bots and autonomous negotiations or sourcing or whatever are available. It's live, it's existing today. Nevertheless, level 0, where we do everything offline and via email, is still also around. So we have the horse and we have the self-driving car basically at the same time. And it's now about us trying to navigate our way all the way through it and when to find the right tool for the right exercise, right? And this is why I love the idea of a toolkit or a toolbox when it comes to negotiations, because it's really about picking the right tool at the right time. And so today, after, as I said, 20 years or 25 years of technology, we're unfortunately still very much focused on our simple techniques, where we just use the same old hammer all the time. And today I want to talk a little bit more about how can we bring in some of these other aspects into our toolkit and become more versed in using them. So basically, there will be 4 aspects that we will touch upon after a little detour into the negotiation classics, as I call them. And that is auctions, probably one of those things that most people are already familiar with. Then scenario optimization, then bots, and then how we can combine all of those things in negotiation design. So those are the topics that we want to cover today in this webinar. It's not a deep dive into any of them. You could probably spend an hour or 2 or a day on each individual topic. We don't have that much time, and I don't want anybody to sit in front of their computer for that long, but we want to give you a little bit of a glimpse into the topic and then see where the discussion at the end of the day can take us. So let's start out with the classic elements. I call it mastering the fundamentals. And considering we're talking about tools, I think there's no tool in procurement that is more widely known than the 2x2 matrix. We use it for everything at all times, and I love it because it's so simple in terms of its visualization. But when we talk about supplier segmentation, that's where we usually try to apply it, right? And it's about, you know, how important is somebody to us, and how important or like how difficult is, or like how big of a impact do they have on the business? Let's put it that way. And so we then just take these 4 fields and try to design an approach of how to manage suppliers that fit into the different buckets, right? Now we can take the very same approach when it comes to negotiations as well, because in the perfect world, we would use this kind of understanding of who we're dealing with in order to determine how to treat them, how to approach a negotiation, and which kind of tool and technology we might want to use. I don't think that's really the case today in most instances, but it is definitely something that's possible. And that's the kind of multiple layers that I really enjoy when thinking about this. The other thing that I always found really interesting when I changed sides, when I became a vendor as well, even though in the field of procurement, is that vendors have a very, very similar approach. They also use the 2x2 matrix. They just change the wording on the x-axis and on the y-axis, and instead of strategic fit and business impact, it becomes attractiveness and relative value. So they basically look at it from the perspective of like, do I really want to deal with you or not? And I think that is a perspective already that very few people in procurement try to take. We don't really put ourselves in the shoes of the other side at times, because we might be in a big corporation, and so therefore, we're strong, we have the power, and we don't have to necessarily. But the second we start thinking about our business to them from their side, maybe our tactics should change. Maybe there's different arguments, maybe there's different things that they value. And as soon as we start thinking about this, we're actually already in the middle of the preparation for a negotiation. And I think that is really what's extremely important. A good negotiation is only as good as we prepare for it. And there's lots of different tools. And as I said, this is not a negotiation 101 training where we go through all of these tools. I just brought a couple of them. But every single time I prepare for a presentation, I still look for a checklist to make sure that I thought about everything. I still try to think about the preferences of the other side and how that compares to mine. I think about the partner. I think about one pager that I try to put together in order to have all of my arguments in a very structured way, and already try to think about possible responses. Responses from the supplier side. So that's basically all these trusted tools that we've heard of a million times, that I'm sure CIPS offers plenty of trainings to dive into as well. And I think that are well tested and needed. But because this is about enhancing the toolkit, I just really want to leave you with these couple of points to conclude this part of the session. Come prepared. So never walk into a negotiation unprepared. I think that's the #1 rule. Know your roles. That's the second one that is extremely important to me, because a lot of times when you go into a negotiation with multiple people, people don't really have a reason to be there, and that's making the situation uncomfortable. Everybody should be there for a reason, have a clear task and a clear role to play, and you can leverage that, especially in the negotiation setup. Know your power. Coming back to what I said before about how important is my business really to the other side, and what kind of cues have I given away to the supplier so that they can also understand how I might feel about them. Especially being in sales, I found that procurement very often gives away a certain feeling already of, I want to work with you, and this is just, like a task to be done. And so looking at it again from the perspective of a procurement professional, I think it's very easy to avoid. It's very easy to hold that mask up a little bit longer and not to give that away. But if we know that and we know what they want, then we can have an advantage in that negotiation. Quid pro quo, or tit for tat, it's often also called. It's about never give anything and don't take anything in return. I think that's very important. When you give up something, try to get something, change the overall pie a little bit so that there's still something in it for you. Again, coming from a sales, or like having learned the sales side now as well, it's very often about then trying to change the total scope of the package, or like just changing other elements. So therefore, really watch out that if you take something that the other side doesn't really get anything else that they want, or if you have to give something, that you try to get something for yourself. Number 5, master the silence, I think is also one of those evergreens that is very, very uncomfortable. I'm always very uncomfortable when somebody sits in front of me and just stares at me. And I was like, oh, did you fall asleep? Is everything okay? So try to, like, if somebody tries to use it on you, try to break it and ask them if they're okay, if they have understood everything, instead of coming up with another counter proposal of how they might feel better about the situation, and really try to leverage it. Because again, try it with your partner, with whoever, to just sit there in silence for 30 seconds. It's so uncomfortable. And if you can do that in negotiation, sales wants to talk. So they want to say something to you. So therefore, this is a very, very powerful one. The other one here is one at a time. So don't tell people right from the beginning, this is everything that I want from you. Try to say, I want this. Okay, now that I got that, I want that. And really slice it up. Salami slicing is another way of phrasing this, but it's, again, something that is very powerful, because people very, very rarely ask, okay, stop. Can you tell me all of the things that you want from me before we continue this conversation? So therefore, continue doing that, because I think, you win over sales with that one. It also enables you to say just one last thing or one more thing at the very end. Like it's all done and dusted, but just this one more thing to push us over the line. It's so simple for you to do. And, like, you very often get what you ask for just because the other side wants to conclude the negotiation. And so therefore, like, it's an easy win, I would say. And last but not least, though, know your limits. Know also when to walk away, when it's not worth it to continue negotiating anymore, because you're too far apart. And even in that, there's an opportunity to get back to the negotiation table by saying, okay, we can't do this, and to walk away and just let it sit and wait until the other person comes back. Again, so those are the classics that I always refer to, and that I believe if we're really good at those, I think we're well prepared for 80% of all of the negotiations we usually have to do. But because it's only the 80%, and this is the part that other people get trained on as well, let's now talk a little bit about the power of technology and how we can use technology in order to enhance that toolkit further. Because whenever we use technology, and I think that's really a very important aspect, it's still about people. We're still dealing with individuals on the other side that have to do certain things in most cases. And so therefore, technology is never about technology. It's always about people engaging with technology. And I think that's the part that a lot of software vendors get wrong, where they just talk about technology, when really we need to talk about how can we as people use tools in order to, like, enhance our powers and our capabilities. So as I said before, I want to talk about auctions, I want to talk about optimization, and I want to talk about bots, because those are 3 topics that are very, very prominent. After that, we will then talk how we can combine technology and offline behaviors in a little bit more detail. So I think the most classic negotiation technology out there is e-auctions. They have a bad name with some people, they have a fantastic name with other people. I think they just have a great name, and I think they have a great lot to offer for us in procurement, if we really understand how to use them and when to use them. I think that's usually where the challenges come in, that people apply the wrong thing in the wrong moment, and then things can go terribly wrong. But if you actually know a little bit about it and what works well in what moment, then you can become really well versed in applying them to your advantage. So I think the benefits are clear to everybody. We can apply some pressure, we can get more savings, get the time down that it takes us to negotiate, and we can get more transparency. And from a definition perspective, I think there's really a couple of important call outs here. Electronic auction needs to be time-based. I think that's one of the pretty things that brings the cycle time down, right? Because in 15 minutes, you can get it all done. It's electronic, that's important. if you want to have an electronic auction, but there's also auctions that you have offline. But I think in procurement, the electronic versions are a little bit more prominent. It's about transparency. It's about transparency through feedback. It's about everybody knowing immediately what's going on. And I think that's bringing us to this real-time element here in the definition, because it's literally like within a second, everybody knows where they stand. And that brings us to this last part here with competition, because it doesn't work, obviously, if there's just one person or one party involved. But if there's competition, if there's true competition, then it's very powerful to know that you might not have the leading bid. And so that's why I think these are a couple of elements just from just in one short statement of a definition. We already touched on so many things that are important to us and to make it work as well. If we now take that, and so that's literally the last slide on this topic, to this next level, then there's basically 3 different types of auctions. And I think, again, when it comes to talking about toolkits, very often people only think about the first one, the English reverse auction. That's the only one people think of. That's the only one people know. And that's also explaining why for a lot of people, it's not a good tool, because it might not always fit. And again, we're talking about a toolkit, so it doesn't have to always fit. It just needs to be applied at the right time. But even within auctions now, there's these 2 other types, like the Dutch auction and the Japanese auction. The Dutch, where it's going up, and the first one who says, yes, I want your business for that price, gets it. The Japanese one, where it goes down and people are saying, are you willing to sell it to me for price X? Yes. Then are you willing to still sell it to me at X minus 1? And everybody has to say yes or no at every step of the way. I think those are 2 other types that if people were more aware of them and when they make sense and what are the kind of settings that you have to play around with, you can change the total discussion, because all of a sudden it's not it's a one-size-fits-all approach. No, there's so many nuances, there's so many different types, there's so many different settings that we can apply, that somebody who's really interested can just spend hours and days just on this particular topic. A friend of mine has written a full book about it, right? So therefore, like you can talk for hours and hours, and there's a lot of ways of how you can apply this one technology. And I think it's very important that everybody is aware. If you decide to use it, different story, but I think it's very important to be aware of the benefits and the shortcomings of that as part of building your toolkit. Now, the second one that I wanted to talk to you about is sourcing optimization. So sourcing optimization, if you think again about this ladder, is on step number 4. That means it combines basically the benefits of the previous ones. So it has the capabilities of sourcing, where you can go out, you can do your RFI, collect information, you can do your RFQ and collect your prices, and you can run auctions if you want to. But what makes it especially interesting is that the additional capability it brings is on the analytics side. So it helps you or allows you to actually run a lot more powerful analytics in a somewhat automated way in order to then think about different scenarios. And I think this idea of scenarios is really what makes it so special, and why I think it's really a game changer for a lot of organizations. Maybe not when you do a free bids and a buy, but definitely when you have more complicated or more or like events where there's more items, more suppliers, more regions, whatever the more may represent. But as soon as there's more than, okay, I have 3 suppliers on 1 item, this becomes very, very powerful. So what it basically means is that when you think about, again, the sourcing process of the RFI and the RFP, we collect all of this information. And I said earlier, we can't really do anything with it, right? It's usually then like, oh yeah, we did our exercise and we did our analysis, and now we have shortlisted and now we move on. We don't look back at it. What these advanced technologies allow you to do is to actually incorporate all of this information, because the RFI is one piece of information. Your stakeholders, they might have certain ideas of how they would love to work with the supply market. There's some technical limitations that may reduce how you can actually award your business. And all of that is considered as business constraints here on the left side, or business rules. And again, it can be about qualification. It can be about preferred suppliers and your segmentation. It can be about the geographic coverage or the capacity that the supplier can offer to you, and your demand being larger than that. It can be about risk, financial risk, whatever. It can be about sustainability, really whatever it may be. All of those things constitute constraints on how you can engage the supply market. And now with scenario-based thinking, what you can do is actually, you can build scenarios around it. And building scenarios in Excel is usually cumbersome, and it depends a little bit on your skills. I definitely know that I very often, very quickly end up with relatively simple ones because I'm not a master of Excel for sure. My PowerPoint skills are questionable, but Excel is definitely more than questionable. But you know, like the tool does it for you, and so all you need to do is basically tell it, okay, what is it that I want to look at? And after I got introduced to this, I never wanted to go back because it's very easy now to say, hey, what happens if I only award to one supplier, to two suppliers, to three suppliers? And if your boss comes and says, what about 5 suppliers? And it's basically changing one button or one number and pressing a button again, and then you have that scenario. And so basically with this kind of tools, what you can do is you can really look at a lot more different angles than just the 1, 2, or 3 that you might wanted to do or had in mind originally, and therefore explore a lot more opportunities of, you know, like seeing, okay, what supplier change might trigger what kind of savings opportunity. And all of these kind of discussions are enabled by just having these scenarios at hand and very quickly swap around between them and see, okay, what's the implication of that? So I think, again, especially now talking about negotiation prep, extremely powerful, just because it gives us a lot more insight and allows us to later on play around with our negotiation design that we will get to in a moment. So that's the second technology. Now, the last technology that I wanted to talk about today is negotiation bots or sourcing bots. There's different slight differences between them. I think they're not super important. But this is really where we are now, and where over the last, let's say, 3 years, I think there has been a lot of development, and there's new products getting launched just as we speak. I know one of the vendors just came out with a new one. And so therefore, it's really something that is still very, very new, and not a lot of companies have really leveraged it yet. But that doesn't mean that it's not a very interesting opportunity to enhance our knowledge and our toolkit. Because what it's basically about is to, especially in the areas where we usually wouldn't be able to negotiate because it's too small, mostly in the tail, for example, to still create value as procurement. Now, not through, oh, we hire somebody else to now look after these kind of things. It's kind of ridiculous, but to really say, hey, I would never look at that. How can I find ways to actually still create value? And so I put in a couple of use cases of how these kind of vendors can support these kind of discussions. It can be around mass-scale supplier outreach, for example. So if you think about, like, let's say your finance department has a new idea, let's extend our payment terms. Great idea, right? Now, do you really want to call out 2,000 suppliers or 5,000 or 50,000 suppliers? It's not really a thing that you can do as a company, right? It doesn't really make a lot of sense. But with a bot, you could actually. Now, if your data allows you to do that, but from a technical perspective, that's the kind of use case where you could just say, hey, reach out to everybody, ask them if they're okay with that. And again, that works with your new general terms and conditions. That works with, oh, we have this new policy that I want you to sign. So whenever it's about reaching out to loads and loads of suppliers, and you just want them to do something relatively simple, then that works perfectly. The other one, and I think this is now talking about like extending or like enhancing your spend coverage, especially, is about negotiating purchase requisitions. I mean, everybody has a threshold under which they don't actively engage, right? Where the stakeholders are doing everything, they just put in a purchase requisition and then it just gets approved right there. So now these kind of bots you can also design in a way that before it now hits procurement, it just immediately reaches out to the person that would receive the PO and say, hey, by the way, can we talk about this, and that? And like if they then say, no, we can't, leave me alone, just get on with it, then that's fine. And the tool accepts that. But sometimes they just say, hey, yeah, sure, we can reduce it by 3% or 5%. And it's value that you create basically out of nothing. So it's not something that you actively do, but if you have, if you're controlling like areas with a lot of tailspin, then this is definitely something that you might want to have a look at, because it's, again, you create value out of thin air, basically. Next one, I think that's the one that is most developed so far already, is spot rate tenders, especially in the logistics area, where but it would work basically in other areas that function like that as well, where it's basically asking, hey, I need to ship something tomorrow from A to B and it's this big. It's very inefficient for somebody now to pick up the phone and be like, hey, calling 5 suppliers, hey, can you do this for me? Do you still have a space tomorrow? And this is exactly where now the bots come in and say, well, nobody should pick up the phone. It's just something like a marketplace almost, where we create our own marketplace, so to say, and say to everybody, hey, here it is. This is a demand that I have. Who wants to fix it for me? And then get a rate and get on with it. So I think this is one of those areas that has been around for, let's say, 3 years and is definitely probably the furthest developed. Very interesting. And I think there's a lot of more use cases where if the market functions like that, very ad hoc, this could be very, very useful. And then I talked about it earlier as an example already, but payment term negotiations is definitely one of those where everybody is immediately jumping on it. And it's like, oh yeah, let's do that. Again, I think the important part here is that it is still young. And from what I know from the CIPS group in the MENA region in Bahrain, like you guys are very, very open to new technologies. So I think this is something that could be very, very interesting for you. I think also in terms of like the kind of industries that you have, it could be very, very useful and exciting to have a closer look at that, especially because these companies are very much open to find these new use cases, to experiment a little bit, and to find the one partner that says, okay, let's do this, let's try this, even though it's not tried and tested 100 times with other companies. So therefore, I think very, very exciting. Now that's technology. I hope that's okay to stop that. Again, I'm not trying to sell tech anymore. I'm just a very big believer that tech has a lot of opportunity to offer. But what I really am excited about is negotiation design, because as I said earlier, it's about people using technology and finding a way to get smarter and make better decisions by using these kind of different tools. And all of the ones that I just mentioned have a role to play in that. Now, when it comes to negotiation design, we very often read about game-theoretic negotiation design, which sounds even more fancy and nicer. But what it is playing on is that people are trying to predict how the other side will react to a certain action that I put forward, or to a certain game that I want to play with them. And so therefore it's absolutely true. And whenever there's a game, as you know, before you can play, you need to understand a little bit of the rules and how to play the game. So now with negotiation design, it's about the playing field, the what I say, the players, so who's playing, and then we're talking about the game, the how, the rules. And so what this is about is really like when we think about the playing field, it's like, as I said before, there's business constraints, right? There's a market environment. There's realities out there that I need to take into consideration when I negotiate. And this is about establishing all of that. Looking at the market, talking to stakeholders, understanding what it is that they want, or what it is that they don't want, or are not willing to do with you. And then basically from there, come up with these criteria and these restrictions to really set the boundaries. And it's like basically painting the outline of your field. Now that we have done that, it's about deciding who's playing. I talked about it earlier in the classic negotiation tips. Know your roles, right? And this is exactly that. So who is actually on the field with me? Who is joining the room? Who's in the background? Who is a potential escalation point? Really being very clear about all of the different players on my side, but also on the side of the supplier, because the supplier has the same kind of hierarchy in their organization potentially that they could leverage if they wanted to. And really understanding that and understanding who should talk to whom when about what, that's really where this becomes very, very interesting. Because once we have that, then we can start talking about or talking to our suppliers and start to communicate with them. And this is where really the magic then happens. It's all about communication. Negotiation is always about saying something or not saying something in a way. And then lastly, the third step is really actually playing the game. So it's deciding what kind of negotiation type. So do I use a tool? Do I do something via the phone or offline or via email? Then actually executing on it, communicating with the suppliers, and then really preparing, conducting the negotiation, preparing for the next round. So this is really then the actual playing of the game. And so all of these 3 steps we need to walk through. And again, we could spend hours just talking about that, but I think just trying to understand these kind of principles connects, okay, where are the classic components in there? And how can we now bring in, especially when it comes to the negotiation types, how can we leverage technology to actually execute for us? Yeah, so basically, just as in the standard toolbox, I think here in this space, there's again a bunch of different tools that can be applied. Like again, these one-pagers, these negotiation communication packs or playbooks, they're called, in order to stay with the game analogy here. I think really powerful tools. It can be developed once, and then once you have understood them, it can really be applied repeatedly. And I just focus on this picture here in the very front, just to show you what I talked about in terms of the timing between things. Like designing a negotiation for a complex event can have multiple stages. And this kind of process that I just described, you need to do at every step of the process. So every single time, look at the information, prepare it, conduct, and then go back, change it, update it, to then make sure that you're sharp for the next round of the negotiation. And some of that, as I said, will be offline. Others will be done via auctions. Then there's other types where there's live auctions that people often use in this kind of setup. So where you basically bring in all of the suppliers to your office. That could be one of the steps of the game, right? So there's a lot of different ones. And yeah, as I said, there's a couple of tools that can be used in order to prepare for that. But my favorite one, and that's the last one that I wanted to share with you today, is about priming. It's like we all have heard the sentence, timing is everything. Preparation is everything. My favorite saying is priming is everything in negotiation, because that is the part where we actually try to get under people's skin and try to get into their head a little bit. And it's not something that we do at the end of the sourcing process during the negotiation. It is something that we do throughout the entire sourcing process, where from the very moment we send out the RFI, or even like 12 months before we will send it out, we already start trying to send certain messages to people. And from a technical perspective, what priming is, it's I create one stimulus here, later on I create another trigger here, and that triggers something that I planted before. So if you have watched the movie Inception, it's a little bit like that. It's the idea of an idea with inside an idea. That's what we're trying to do here. And that's where I think it's a super cool thing, because if you start getting into it, you're like, oh yeah, okay, what do I have to say here in order to get a certain reaction here? If you try to think about it from a different angle, let's say your wife said in April to you, look at these nice earrings. Nothing happens for 2 months. And then all of a sudden there's this flyer on the table. Looks like somebody forgot it there. And oh, there's a nice pair of earrings. And then comes the birthday in November. She gets the present and it's like, oh, surprise. She acts surprised because she planted that idea a long, long time ago. And priming is exactly that. Trying to give an idea to somebody a long time ago, and it can be the start of the sourcing process or even earlier. And then to trigger those with other actions throughout the process to make people react in a certain way. So it's usually about us trying to make people either uncomfortable by creating more stress or by giving them something like that is a little bit more gratifying, and being like, oh yeah, done a good job, you know, like as a feedback to the first round of negotiations, whatever it may be, really. That's the kind of idea. And in auctions, it's perfectly executed because it's in real time, and so it's in a very condensed kind of format. But as I said, now in negotiation design, it can really happen across the entire process. And it's really about who is delivering what message, when, and how. That's really what it comes down to. So that's basically what I wanted to share with you. Those are a couple of tools and techniques of how I believe you can enhance your negotiation toolkit. To summarize it, I think you still have to master the basics, because only when you know the rules, you can actually break them and know when to apply what. Tech is changing the game. So ignoring the technology is not gonna work out for us. It never does. The internet is still around as well. So therefore, we should definitely understand what it is, when to apply it. And if we then decide not to do it, that's perfectly fine, but it's our decision. So I can only highly recommend to engage with it. When it comes to designing negotiations or the game, it really takes time. I think it's well worth it, but it definitely is something that you need to invest time into, and that shouldn't be done lightly. And then when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? So that's not the idea of a toolbox. A toolbox means that you actually know when to apply which tool, and that's what makes you a very good negotiator, and not just somebody with a hammer. And so lastly, to me, this really means that using online and offline tools together is how we can create the greatest value for our companies, and actually get a big advantage for us as negotiators. So yeah, that's what I wanted to share with you. Thank you very much for listening in and still being around. If you want to follow me as on LinkedIn, I would be more than happy. Also, if you want to follow the company, more than happy. And on YouTube, we will start releasing more videos on little practical tips like this now as well. So therefore, again, if you want to follow that, I would very much appreciate it. So with that, Fadila, now we can go to the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Fabian, for your interested and informative session. Really very beneficial information. So
Good.
Let us go to the questions. I have one question. Where is it? From Stan. He was asking about. When you said you will ask for several things, not at once, you will ask every time for different requirement. So Stan is asking, want to be backfire to ask everything separately?
Yeah, so what I mean is more really in the moment of the negotiation. So once we have clarity on all of the different things that we want from somebody, what I mean is more that instead of saying, hey, I need you to reduce the price of this one, of that one, here I want you to do that, here you need to improve the offer like this, and so on and so forth. And you have like these 10 things that you want to negotiate with somebody, then in certain instances, it might make sense because, you know, it's round one of a negotiation of multiple rounds. Then might say to say, hey, here's the 10th thing that I need to work on. See you later. If you're at the later stage of the negotiation, it can become very powerful to just say, okay, let's talk about product one now, because product one is really something that I struggle with. And once you have agreed on product one, okay, so now let's talk about product two. And I don't think it's backfiring. It might not always work, but again, that's why it's a toolkit, right? It's one of the tools. I just think that in certain instances, if the other party is not then playing in on it and being like, oh, no, stop telling me all of the things so that I can give you a holistic response, then you can usually get something in your favor, bag it, take it off the negotiation table, and move on. So that's more what I'm talking about. Yeah, I hope that clarifies it.
Thank you very much. Hope it's clear for you, Stan. Okay, I have a couple of questions from Anish Kumar from UAE. So he's asking, one of the an effective negotiation is going to the table with less or poor information. However, procurement professionals are always in a rush to close the deal and get the contract signed. So how much information is good enough information? How do we compromise on the quantity of information versus the time required to close the negotiation?
This is a little bit coming back to me like, oh yeah, in 5 minutes I have this negotiation. Let's have a quick look at the numbers again. I don't think that there's a right or wrong, right? I mean, like, management by definition is making decisions under incomplete information. So we will always have, or we will never have full information. And I think we need to be comfortable with that. It just, what I keep seeing is that people don't prepare at all. They just rush in without trying to even step back and be like, okay, what is it that I really want to achieve here? And what is it that I really need in order to achieve that? They just go in. And while they're talking, they're making up the plan. I do that very often in personal relationships where I just like, oh, I had this idea while I started talking. I don't even think about that. That's my problem. But we shouldn't do that as professionals. We shouldn't do that when we're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars at time. There we should just say to our stakeholders as well, hey, like, if this saves us then 25,000 or 10% or whatever, let's stop. In 30 minutes, it will still be there. And sometimes it's all that it takes, give yourself another 30 minutes. I'm not saying you should try to spend another 2 weeks and upset everybody, but just try to be a little bit more thoughtful. Have I prepared? Do I know what I want to get out of this? Do I know what triggers that other person? And with these 2-3 questions that you ask yourself, you can usually already get 2 steps further than you would if you would have just walked in. That's how I would see that.
Okay, perfect. Another question from Anish. In a negotiation room, traditional negotiators pay attention to non-verbal cues of the players. In this age, especially with the millennials and virtual engagement, how important is to understand the non-verbal cues in a negotiation?
I think it's still exactly the same. I think interpreting them might be sometimes a little bit more difficult because, like back in the day when somebody was staring out of the window and was like, you could think, oh yeah, maybe he's not so interested anymore. Whereas nowadays that person might just have a very short attention span. So I think that's what really makes it difficult to interpret these kind of cues. And now then again, especially because our world is becoming a lot more connected, right? I'm giving a presentation from Switzerland to you in Bahrain. Very big difference, like very different cultures in terms of negotiating, but also in general in terms of the culture. And so therefore, I think our life became a little bit more complicated because the world is more connected and we need to spend more time on trying to understand cultural differences and those kind of topics that, again, also have been around 20 years ago and 30 years ago and people said they were important. Now that we actively engage with people across the world a lot more normally, we should still do that, and probably more. Millennials, different topics, but I think the truth is the non-verbal cues, they're still there. And if somebody is smiling or not smiling, paying attention to you, looking at you, or just fiddling around with their phone, all of those things we should still try to have a little bit an eye on. And yeah, then make a conclude whatever that may mean.
Thank you. Rajiv is asking, how can we negotiate with a single source vendor?
I don't know. Next question.
Okay.
No, I mean, the single source is, I think for me, single source is always a very, very interesting one, because there's a difference between a monopolistic negotiation and a single vendor negotiation, right? In a monopolistic negotiation, there is nobody else. And even a duopoly or oligopoly, where there's just 2 or 3 or 4 players in the world, very different, very difficult. When it comes to single supplier negotiations, it's usually our fault. It's us who made him the only supplier. It's not him. It's not like her who said, oh, I'm the only one. No, it's like our company that said, I have a single sourcing strategy potentially. And if it was a strategy, then somebody should have thought about it with a 10, 15-year timeline. But very often we find ourselves in a single supplier situation because the stakeholder says, I need to work with that person. They're the only one who can do it. And again, especially in indirect procurement, we see that all the time, because people are like, oh, he understands me. He gets what I want, right? And so in those situations, I think that's where this kind of scenario based thinking makes perfect sense, because if we can bring in other people, no matter how realistic it is at the beginning that they may win, if we can show to somebody, hey, these are your options, and I understand you might preference those over those. If we can still come in and say, well, but it cost the company 2 million because you said that you can only work with this one, then you start to have a conversation and a negotiation on the inside before you go out to the supplier to have the negotiation. Because if that person then admits, okay, yes, that is costing us money, all of a sudden you can potentially turn them into an ally to come in with you into the negotiation situation, have them play a role and have them be the bad cop, for example. And you in procurement played a good cop. Reverse the roles and what people would expect to see happen. If we can win over people like that, then I think we can also be very successful in single supplier negotiations. Again, a monopoly, a little bit of a different setup, but single supplier, I wouldn't be too afraid of.
Thank you. There is another interesting question from Anish. He's asking, is it okay to lie in negotiation to get a better deal? So sometimes you said you have received a lower price or lower offer, while he is the lowest actually.
Yeah. So we're on record. This is CIPS. No, we're not lying. It's not okay. We shouldn't do that. But, and here's the, again, when it comes to priming, for example, it's not about lying. It's about painting a picture, right? And so I think there we have a lot more opportunity. I personally really don't think we should tell somebody there's somebody cheaper. We should try to make other people cheaper. We should try to help other people to put pressure on that supplier again by coming down to their pricing. And that's where, again, if we now say, hey, we have, for example, a Dutch auction, right, where the price goes up. If we paint a picture that there is a very serious amount of competition, everybody is very competitive. So I want to award the business to the best supplier with the best pricing and the best overall package, then all of a sudden we didn't lie. But that person will most likely win that auction. And because the story was good, most likely at a lower price point than what he was offering to us today. And so this is, again, coming back to the right tool at the right time will prevent us from having to do things that would be considered unethical otherwise.
Thank you. So Jacob is asking, is the priority in negotiation basically about the price and terms and condition?
Say it again, the priority?
The priority of negotiation, is it about the price and terms and conditions?
Well, I guess that really depends on the negotiation and on the situation. So I definitely believe that there's a lot of negotiations where that is the case, where it's all about, okay, we have pre-established that the quality, that the deliverables and all of that is comparable, and now we managed to bring it back to that. But I think especially in this day and age where a lot of other topics like risk management, like sustainability, like 15 other things are extremely important. I mean, I wouldn't be able to say it's always just that, right? If your strategy is to diversify your supply base, then it's important to get the right commercials in place and the right conditions. But at the end of the day, you will accept something that is not the best because you want to diversify your supply base, right? So it really depends on the objective of the project to then determine, okay, how can we now fulfill that? And once we have fulfilled that, then we can come back to looking at it from a more commercial perspective.
Thank you. So Makki Abbas is asking, what does a negotiation strategy for a buyer should incorporate prior to meeting a supplier?
Say again, what should
what does
the preparation
a negotiation strategy for a buyer should incorporate prior to meeting a supplier?
I mean, I think if you just ask yourself a couple of very simple questions, as I pointed out with these 8 steps, then you have already a very good approach and you should be well prepared. I think in terms of the strategy, again, it needs to come back to what is it that you want to get out of it, and being clear on that one question is already half the prep work, I would say, because we usually don't care about everything in the same way. But if we understand what is important to us and then prioritize that accordingly, I think that's the prep work that I would do, and then just use the tactics in order to try to get the other side to that point.
Thank you. So Abdul Latif is asking, negotiating delivery terms, i.e. OTIF, and lead time is the most important area nowadays. Can you shed light on how delivery time versus price can be balanced as internal customer need faster or in time versus the price?
Well, I mean, I guess I would argue that that really depends on the company and on the category that you're dealing with, because in other areas, I think that's still not all that important. But I do not have the perfect answer of how to do that right now. Sorry. If I would probably make a lot of money right now.
So Zia is asking, will AI, artificial intelligence, help us to control dark purchasing?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I talked about these negotiation bots earlier, there's a lot of AI in that, because it's about designing processes where the tool can detect certain behaviors and then intervene accordingly. So if it detects that, yeah, this is happening here, then should I go? It can make that decision by itself eventually. It gets better. It obviously starts with somebody telling it, right? But eventually it will get better to detect, okay, if I have certain conditions, that signals me that something was not ideal for the company maybe, and a bit last minute. So therefore the negotiation bot should intervene and say, hey, let's negotiate about this. Whereas, in other instances, that might not be the case. And I definitely think that there's a lot of use cases for that. And as I said before, it's already out there. It's starting, it's still small, but it's definitely something that will take up.
So there is another question on, is it okay to provide target pricing?
I would say everybody has done that in one way or the other, right? The question is, do you stick to your target then, or is it a moving target? If the target always moves with the response, then maybe not so much, but I definitely think that's not a problem. I wouldn't necessarily tell somebody the exact price with the cent value to it, but a target can, I give you a target if I say you're 12% above. I've given you a target now to aim for, right? So therefore, I don't think there's anything, questionable about that. It's just, let's make sure that everybody gets that, and not just this one person that I want to win.
Maybe one or two final questions. We have a lot actually in the chat box.
That's great. I love the engagement, and sorry that I cannot answer everything perfectly, but I try.
Another question from Rajiv. How can we negotiate better pricing and terms for a solution that has been obtained by the business technical team and the vendor is confident of getting the order at a higher price or term with the vendor?
Yeah, I have been in that situation before, and I think this is exactly where a couple of those points that I talked about earlier about negotiation design can be super, super powerful. So it's about still trying to understand from the business what it is that they really want, and then we need to make the market. So if somebody else has already tried to shortcut us, then we need to still use the time. And this is one of those where I would suggest not to rush into anything, but to basically say, hey, guys, we still need to do our job. We're in procurement, right? We need to make sure that everything is comparable, that everybody has the same information. And so we can create this environment and this market. And so this is coming back to the single vendor discussion that we had before, right? If we can build a very strong case towards the vendor that there is competition, he is not alone. And even though the business might prefer him, there's opportunities for us to find arguments to say, yes, they might want to work with you, but they also need to live with our policies that unless you're not more than X% more expensive, or unless you're whatever this price or that price, they will still not be able to move forward without the approval of XYZ. Right, and that's where you then can bring in other parties, different roles, change the game, have even their boss potentially play a certain part in that, and that's where really you just need to win them over as business partner and say, hey, I know you want them, that's fine. I couldn't care less. I mean, like, after all, you have to work with them, but in order to make sure that we get the best deal for the company, please work with me in order to build that competition. Help me to negotiate with them and play a role in it. I think that's still very much possible. And that's where then also this idea of business partnering becomes really, really powerful, because once they're part of the game, everybody loves to play. It's that simple.
One final question, and we'll end up this webinar. It's from Nader Saleh. In some cases, during negotiation, there are new input from our internal clients. How to cope with the changes without giving vendors that not all information are in hand?
Yeah, that's a classic, right? Usually what I try to do is then to just say, hey, we have received new information that we need to now evaluate. I wouldn't try to do it on the fly. Again, if you have something like an optimization engine where it's just about, volumes have changed, or like we have a certain criteria that needs to be considered in a certain way, then it doesn't really take you very long, and just asking for a short 30-minute break might be enough in order to prepare and come back to it. If it's something more serious or something that really influences also the proposal of the other party, then I would just say, hey, sorry, but we need to redo certain aspects here. But I did have a conversation once with somebody who started using this scenario-based analytics. He said, hey, before we took a full day, and then every 2 hours we had to take a break in order to run the new data and then continue. Whereas with this kind of technology, very quickly you can be like, oh yeah, I just fed it into the system. No, you're still more expensive, sorry. So it really depends on the type of information and the seriousness of the implication, I would say.
Thank you very much, Fabian, and thank you all for attending this webinar. It was really a very interesting and informative insights and tips that we have received from you. Hope to see you all and in another new webinar next year, hopefully, and Happy New Year to everyone. Thank you all.
Thank you so much for having me again.
Thank you, Fabian. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.